So if that doesn't matter for your recording, we're good. You know, sort of the doorbell going and Amanda taking the shopping in, that's fine.
Okay, so kind of just wanted to start from the beginning, from your side, and go through the ideas of the importance of getting outside, encouraging people to get outside, and what's kind of stopping people, but at the same time just hearing a bit more about yourself, what you've been doing, what got you interested, and then bring it up to right now to why we need more people outside to engage with the world. So for you, have you always been interested in getting outside? Have you always been an outdoors person? Who was your inspiration? Who inspired you to get outside?
Okay, so good questions. So I was brought up in the countryside. I lived in the countryside until I went to university when I was 18. I never lived in a town until then. So I was always just, you know, you go out the back door and I was in the garden, and my parents moved around a bit when I was younger. So I was born in Yorkshire, and then when I was 5, we moved to North Wales. My parents loved Snowdonia. They loved North Wales. We'd had family holidays there and loved the beaches, Black Rock Sands and Harlech and places like that, and the Llyn Peninsula. So they liked that part of the world. And so my dad got a job opportunity in North Wales, and so we moved to North Wales, and that was in the late 70s. And so we had a garden that was reasonably sizable, but it, you know, for a young boy, it was plenty big enough. You know, it was about an acre of garden with lots of bushes and trees and stuff, but it was directly adjoining a large forestry commission forest that went on for miles just behind the village that we lived in. So quite early on, I just got used to, you know, myself and my friends, you know, we'd jump the fence and run off into the woods and have some adventures. And you know, whether that was we were playing at my house, or whether we were playing at my friend Alistair's house, or whether we were playing at my friend Hayden's house, because, you know, the village ran along the edge of the hillside, and behind the village all the way along was forest. So wherever we were playing, we just had to go uphill a bit and we were in the woods. So that, I guess, was just something I grew up with at that point in time in my life, and became comfortable with just rambling off for a few hours and wandering around. And, you know, I remember there was a big drainage ditch through part of the forest, and we used to jump in there and go along the ditch and climb out of it again. And there was some rock slabs, and we used to climb. All of this stuff we probably, surprised we didn't kill ourselves doing, but there were like big rock slabs at one place, you know, sort of, I don't know, they probably weren't that steep, you know, certainly weren't rock climbing, but, you know, they were sort of 45 degrees or something, and we'd climb up those thinking we were like mountaineers or something. And we just had a great time, and we were always outside. And this is pre-computer days, of course. A friend of mine the other way that I occasionally played with, he's the first person I remember having an early Atari console, you know, and you'd play, I don't know, ping pong or Space Invaders or something on it. You'd have to put the big cartridges in and play it. But that sort of thing was only what you did if it was raining and it was too cold and horrible to go outside. Otherwise, we were just always outside, making dens, running around the forest, riding bikes. And so I just had one of those childhoods where I grew up outdoors. And as I say, my parents moved us there intentionally. They were keen walkers. And so, you know, they hiked me up Snowdon when I was 7, and we used to go walking up in the woods as well. And, you know, so I just had that childhood of, you know, hills and forest and beaches and whatnot. And then unfortunately, early 80s, high interest rates. I think my dad had taken a pay cut to move to North Wales because it was a bit of a lifestyle transition for them. I think the interest rates went up to about 14% in the early 80s. And they had to move for economic reasons, I think. And so we moved back to the northeast of England, again, a rural area. That was when I was 10. And again, I made friends there, and we were out in there weren't as much in terms of extensive forest there as there were in North Wales. But, you know, we used to go out and play in the backwoods and over the fields, and we're always, again, outside making dens. And it was during that period with those few friends in that little village, which is where my parents still are now, nearly 40 years later. it was the friends I made in that village that when we started getting interested, I guess maybe a little bit more into survival skills, as we didn't know what bushcraft was at that point, so in terms of us playing around outdoors, it was still, well, as I say, it was the 80s, so we were still in the Cold War, so a lot of those sorts of skills around firelighting and whatnot, they were always couched in survivalist terms, and all the publications you could get, if you went into the local newsagents, things like survival weaponry and techniques and outdoor survival, and there were these few publications that you could get, and I think because of the interest that I had in those sorts of things, my dad got me a copy of Lofty Wiseman's Survival Handbook. And even though initially it was, I guess as with many boys, it was the stuff at the front of the book, making little survival kits and what knife to get and all those sorts of things, which interested us. I really loved that book because there were lots of environments explained or described in that book that I'd never been to, so how to survive in the Arctic, what to do in the jungle, all these things. So that, I think, in itself inspired me to think about different parts of the world, and not going as a sort of tourist, but going and adventuring in other wild places. I think that was always, something that I associated with that subject matter. And so I wasn't, interested in surviving, nuclear wars or anything, that was the kind of the sort of the worry that was around. I mean, it seems like such an alien thing now, but it was very present in that period of time until the Berlin Wall, until you got into perestroika and the Berlin Wall coming down and Gorbachev and all that period. I mean, there was, it was a fairly grim period of time in some respects, in terms of people worrying about whether or not we were going to be here in 20 years time, or whether we'd all, have bombed each other and be living in a nuclear winter. So that, I think, we got into the late 80s and things became a lot brighter, and the whole shit in terms of the skills that I was interested in, there was a shift in emphasis for just to being more having skills just for living your outdoor life. I think, it wasn't, I was growing up, in terms of my teens and what I was interested in, but I also think that the emphasis in sort of survival circles changed during that period as well. So when I, jumped forward a few years, when I actually wanted to have someone teach me more formally, it was bushcraft was starting to come onto the scene as a term, and Ray Mears was someone I became aware of in the 1990s, and he'd been on Country Tracks, and he'd had a kind of anthropological series called World of Survival, which I was quite interested in, because again, he went to different parts of the world, Kalahari, Siberian, taiga, and various other places, and saw how people lived in those areas. And it wasn't it was survival because they were surviving there, but it was more than that. It was, how did they live in those places? And that definitely interested me. And so when I went to get somebody to learn from, I gravitated towards Ray's school, Woodlaw, and I ended up doing some courses there. And that's kind of how I started down the track of learning more formally, but then also starting to assist on courses and then working full time in outdoor education. So it was a transition which happened over time, and I'm kind of jumping some big steps there because I also registered to do the I was a keen hiker. I did a lot of walking in Scotland. I registered to do the mountain leader training and then the mountain leader assessment, and so there was that kind of backpacking, hiking kind of strand to my outdoor life as well. In my late teens and early 20s, I was big into mountain biking, and this is before the kind of split between downhill and cross-country discipline, and it's all kind of bifurcated several times since then. But back then it was largely cross-country racing with a bit of downhill, and maybe there'd be a time trial at an event or something, a downhill time trial, but it was largely cross-country racing. And again, because I grew up in the northeast of England, my parents were based in the northeast. There were, we had the Yorkshire Dales to the south of us, we had the North Pennines to the north of us, and so I was always just cycling around over old tracks, and so I loved doing that. I loved just getting out and getting the wind in my hair and going out and seeing what was about on my bike as well. Because you know, not having a car, I didn't have a car until I didn't own a car until I was in my 30s. So, you know, I having a bike, you know, you can get out and see much more and go further than you can on foot. So yeah, I just love being out. I always just love being out under my own power. And the bush, you know, I'm known for bushcraft skills now, but that all came about because I wanted skills to have while I was out camping, out hiking, out making journeys. It was a set of things that I could take with me, and a knowledge of nature that I could use as I was going. And that was I was never just, you know, never just one for sitting in one spot, just sort of carving all the time, although I do enjoy that. But it was skill sets that I wanted for making journeys. Ultimately, that's the way that my interest developed. So
I didn't realize until a few months ago that you were actually a student of Ray Mears as well, and then you went on to be one of the directors with Woodlaw as well.
Yeah, so I was I first met Ray in the early 2000s. I did a number of so I'd been on a number of courses with his school already, but he hadn't run them. And then I did some that he was running, and I guess got to know him a little bit, and he got to know me a little bit during that time. And then I did a winter Arctic course up in northern Sweden with him and Lars Falt in 2003. And Lars headed up the Swedish military survival school. He was at the parachute ranger school, and then he was tasked with setting up survival training, and which he did. And he's kind of one of the grandfathers of survival training. He's highly knowledgeable, very experienced, and I was very pleased ultimately to be able to work with him as well as be a student on a course with him. And so during that course, well, it was actually just after that course. So during that course, I did a number of things. I asked if I could do a number of things while I was there that weren't on the syllabus, but because I'd done a number of other courses with Ray, I was like, can I apply these things and do these things here, even though they're not on the course? And he was like, yeah, sure, if as long as you do a good job with them. So myself and the small sort of group that I was with, we did some extra stuff that he was happy with. And on the way home from that, he asked me, we were traveling on the same internal flight. We were transiting in Stockholm and then the same flight back to the UK. So we had this time in Stockholm for a couple of hours when everyone was sitting around drinking coffee. And he came over and said, oh, do you fancy assisting me on some of the courses in the UK? And I said, yes, of course, I'd love to do that. So that was in 2003. So I started, I guess, a couple of months after that, just on the spring courses, May, June, that sort of time in 2003, assisting him and a guy called Juha Rankinen, who used to work with him, a Swedish guy. And yeah, I mean, initially it was just weekends, holidays. I had a proper job, so to speak, as some people like to call it. I did maths at university, and I was a numerate graduate, and I was working in financial services because when I graduated, I was skint, and I needed a job that, you know, I needed something that would pay me some money. And so I was doing that. But the outdoor side of my life was where my passion was. And that's been the one constant since I was a kid, really. I just loved doing outdoor stuff. And so I'd never really, I guess because I was an academic kid, I was academically bright. Nobody'd ever mentioned to me that that was something you could do as a career. You know, it was just like, you know, you're good at maths and physics and economics and, you know, what have you, go and do your A levels. You know, I did 5 A levels, go to university, do a maths degree, get a job, earn some money. And that's kind of what I did. And, you know, and I wasn't dissatisfied with that, but equally it wasn't where my passion was. And I think we need to be very careful about giving people advice to follow their passion, because you've got to balance that with eating and having somewhere to live and, you know, having some money for looking after kids when you have them, or retiring when you do that, and all those sorts of things. So you have to balance those things. But equally, you know, I was trying to follow my passion in my spare time, and, you know, holidays and weekends and things, I was backpacking or cycling or then once I started doing courses with Woodlaw, I started doing those. And then once I was offered a role to assist, I started doing that. So that was 2003. And I did that for a number of years, just part-time. And then late 2005, I got a call one Sunday, and it was Ray's late wife, Rachel, who was a lovely woman I got on very well with, and they'd been talking, and they basically wanted to offer me a full-time job to help lead the outdoor course side of the business. So, and because I had a background in business, that was one of the reasons they offered me the job, because I had a passion for the sharp end of what they were doing, but I also had something of a commercial background. And so they saw those two things being useful for their business. And so they offered me a job, which I considered. And then I said yes. I took a big pay cut from what I was doing in my then day job, but then I jumped to that. And I always took the view, well, if it really doesn't work out, I can always go back. You know, if it 6 months down the line, a year down the line, 2 years down the line, I can always go back. And I haven't. You know, I'm still here working full time in outdoor education. What are we now, 15 years later? So I worked with Ray full time for about 5 years, and then all of the tasks that they'd given me, I had 4 specific things that they wanted me to do to help develop the business when I joined, and I'd done all of those things, and we'd increased the revenue of the business. We'd got a lot of people on board in terms of staff and trained them up, and got a training structure in place and various other things. And you know, I was running a lot of the courses for them as well, and organizing trips, and I'd put everything in place. And there were certain things that I wanted to do then to sort of push on from that. And Ray wasn't so keen to do those. His focus was more on the television side and books and whatnot. And so he was happy with the way it was. And there were certain directions I wanted to go in personally that wouldn't have worked within the constraints of his business. And so we went our separate ways, and I set Frontier Bushcraft up in late 2010. And we started running courses in 2011. And that's, you know, 10 years ago now. We just had our 10th anniversary, the end of 2020. So
wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
So, yeah, thank you. So yeah, it was a good time. I mean, Ray can be quite difficult to work with sometimes, and anybody who's worked with him will tell you that. I mean, he's quite definitive about what he wants, and he's got high standards. But I think ultimately, if you can bear that, it's good for you in terms of your development. So,
right. Yeah. So when you branched off and did your own business, did you just start off pretty much from scratch by yourself, or did you not take people with you, but did you bring in a team straight away, or was it just you?
Yeah, I mean, it was just me initially. Funnily enough, one of the first things I wanted to do was write a blog. It was, as I say, late 2010, early 2011, and that was kind of in vogue at that time, you know, blogging very much, you know, and there was lots of stuff I wanted to put out to the world, and I felt that was the right time for me to be doing that. So I started to blog. And when I started doing that, that was a really good thing for me to do, because it let the world know that I was there and I was independent. I hadn't started Frontier at that point. There were a few months between me starting my blog and starting Frontier. And even once I'd incorporated Frontier Bushcraft, I didn't even have a website at that point, you know, and, you know, I built the website in the following spring, and then we started running a few courses. And initially it was literally people just contacting me and saying, can you do something for us? You know, I think the first course we ran was a private course for a group of dads and sons, you know, so we just started doing stuff like that. In terms of people who worked with me, there were a couple of people who used to work at Woodlaw who were part-time, who once they saw that I'd set up, they asked if they could come and work with me. I didn't poach anybody. I don't believe in being destructive in that way. But a couple of people like Emma Hampton and Ian Lawson contacted me and said, we'd like to come and work with you part-time, because we liked working with you part-time when, you know, because they mainly worked with me anyway when I was running courses at Woodlaw. So they wanted to continue working with me. They enjoyed it. So yeah, that's how we started, just with a few people that we were used to working together and had a good rapport and knew what each other were about. And that's what we started doing. And then I guess we started advertising a little bit more. We used to run Google ads and things, and yeah, just got things, you know, a little bit more visible. But also the blog helped in terms of just writing articles that people were sharing around Facebook and Twitter and things, and that helped. And yeah, then a couple of people, I recruited a few people who had been students of mine on various courses in the past, who, again, they contacted me and said, any chance we could be an assistant? And they were good guys. And so I took them on as assistants, you know, just part-time. And yeah, we just kind of grew from there. And most of those people that started, Emma's a school teacher now, and Ian's emigrated to New Zealand, but most of the people that started with me around that time, and I guess that was mostly around 2012, 2013, when we were growing a bit at those early stages, they're all still with me. So, you know, Henry's still with me, Matt's still with me, James came over from Woodlaw ultimately. He was another senior instructor at Woodlaw. So yeah, and we've got a very stable team of good people, and we enjoy working together, and we enjoy sharing what we know with the students who come on our courses. So yeah, and all of a sudden we're 10 years down the line. You know, time flies when you're having fun. So yeah. So yeah, and we've got a very stable team of good people, and we enjoy working together, and we enjoy sharing what we know with the students who come on our courses. So yeah, and all of a sudden we're 10 years down the line. You know, time flies when you're having fun. So yeah.
So most people obviously know you from YouTube.
Some people do. I mean, I don't. I mean, people who know me from YouTube say that. It's kind of self-selecting, isn't it? You know, it's like, oh, you know, most people who know me from YouTube. That's true. But you know, I always feel like I've got quite a small presence on YouTube. You know, I don't know, I actually don't even check it that often, but I think I've got about 60,000 followers now, on subscribers on YouTube. But I don't put stuff out as often as I should. I do constantly berate myself for not being as consistent as people would like me to be on YouTube. And you know, I look at people I know, like, you know, Mike at TA Outdoors, who has just gone, you know, exponential with his followers, and some other people in the bushcraft world as well, who, you know, Mike doesn't even consider himself a bushcraft channel, although he does stray into bushcraft. And I've done some videos with him for his channel, which have been very well received. But there are people who are more firmly footed in their own mind in the bushcraft world, and they've got much bigger followings than me. And I always feel like I'm kind of small fry on the YouTube front. But I'm glad it's bringing people to find me and my other stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I'm pleased people find value in the YouTube stuff.
Yeah, because I have to say, I came across you. Obviously, I'm a big bushcraft fan as well. I suppose, I don't know what you call it, bushcrafter, strange term, but
turning bushcraft into a verb. You know, we've debated that around the campfire for many years. You know, what's bushcrafting, what's a bushcrafter, and it's an interesting it's an interesting question.
Yeah. But I came across you just from the videos you do of your just general expeditions. I think there was one, the first one, I'm sure, probably not the first one, but there was one in particular where you were in Scotland with, I want to say spoons?
Yeah, spoons. Yeah.
going down one of the rivers. I can't even remember where it was now.
Yeah, it was mainly the Tay. So we started up. If people know Scotland, we started up near Crianlarich, which is where the West Highland Way goes through Crianlarich. So we started that far west, but our intention was to end up on the east coast, following, you know, from the watershed down through the Tay system, and that's largely what we did on that trip. It was fun. Yeah.
It looked amazing, and it is one of those things, because now this year, hopefully, once we can get outside, I'm aiming to start canoeing a bit and hitting the water. I've done a little bit before, and it's something that I would love to go more towards. I'm a big hiker and backpacker, but I love being on the water and everything. So that's how I found you. But where did that all start? Because I was going through your YouTube a while ago, and
I hope you didn't look too far back.
You've got a whole big sort of plethora of stuff going from like your canoe trips to obviously your bushcraft skills, and I say that the highlights for me are your presentations and your lectures from various from festival, like bushcraft festivals and stuff. Amazing, brilliant,
Thank you.
Really interesting. But where did that all start? Where did your YouTube start? Was that part of just your blog? Was it to link in with the podcast you also do, which is also brilliant, or is it just something else?
I made a big mistake with YouTube. So it's quite interesting talking about this. Like I say, the last 10 years, it felt like I was in the first few years of this time period for a long time. 2011 and 2012, that kind of period to me just seemed to take a long time. And then all of a sudden I'm now 10 years down the line. And one of the things, I guess it was just when you've got these periods of intense kind of change and productivity, and you're trying to work out your angle and how you're going to take things forwards, they seem like they take a long time. It's like school holidays when you're a kid, they seem, 6 weeks seem to be an eternity, and it's just because your experience is that intense in a way. Everything's new and everything's exciting, and you don't have any other concerns, and you're focused in the moment, and that's it's good quality way of living in a lot of ways. And so one of the things that was a question mark for me at that point was starting a new business in the back end of a recession that came out of a financial crisis in the 2008 2009 period. I had some savings, but I also didn't have a lot of cash, and advertising was expensive, and it still is, in a lot of ways. But what was coming to the fore very quickly, and this seems bizarre to, everything seems so established now, but Facebook was very new, Twitter was new, the iPhone had only come out like 4 years before. Before that, nobody had smartphones. I mean, this is how much the world has changed. Yeah. Was it 2006, 2007, around about that time the first iPhones came out? I think it was about that, wasn't it?
Must have been about
2006, yeah. YouTube had just started, I think 2005. So come the time I started Frontier, all of this stuff was quite new. And as I say, people were writing blogs. And so I was looking at these sort of new social platforms. How can I use this to promote what I'm doing? And I don't just mean that in a completely mercenary commercial way, but it's like, how can I get this material? I'm writing articles on my blog. How can I get that out to more people? How can I use these tools? And that was the way a lot of people looked at those things. They looked at them as platforms through which you could amplify what you were doing elsewhere. So, you write a blog, but then you'd use Facebook or another platform, Twitter, for example. Instagram didn't even exist at that point. Use those platforms to amplify what you were doing, and you'd bring people back to your home base, as it were. And so that was the way that I also approached YouTube. So I started making some videos, and it was influenced by I can't even remember who it was, some sort of online marketing guy that I watched some presentations by, and he had this recommendation of, just think about your customers or your followers or your students. Think about frequently asked questions that you might put on a website or that you might want to answer for them repeatedly. And also think about questions that people never do ask, but maybe they should. And then just make a video about each one of those. So think about 10 frequently asked questions and 10 should ask questions, and keep them really simple, and put them out on your YouTube, and then direct them back to your wherever so that they can find out more about what you do and what you offer. And that's how I started my YouTube channel in 2013. And so, as I say, in retrospect, that was a mistake, because the best strategy with YouTube was just to treat it as a platform and in its own right and build an audience on the platform, which is not what I tried to do initially. I tried to use the eyes that came to my material and shift them elsewhere. And of course, now we know that YouTube really doesn't like that. They like to keep people on the platform because they get more ad revenue. The more time you spend on their site clicking through videos, the more ads you see, the more ad revenue they get. The more ad revenue those videos get, the more they put them up to the top if they keep people on the platform. So that's fundamentally what they like. And I didn't do that because I was just using it to amplify and pull people into my blog, which is what I thought was most important at that point. So that's how the YouTube started. But then over time, I've evolved it into me putting content on there specifically because YouTube's a good place for that type of content that I make for that. And I think if anybody's listening to this or watching this and thinking about wanting to, share what they do or amplify what they do, then that's the best way to, at the moment, it seems, and it has been for some time, the best way to use these platforms is make material that's specific or at least suited to those platforms, and not try and pull people away from those platforms too often.
Yeah. I think saying that's exactly what I'm trying to do as well, I suppose. I don't class myself as a YouTuber or a podcaster or whatever. It's just one of those, it's a library of places that you can go to get whatever you prefer, whether you prefer to watch people or listen to people or read it. Like, I've got all those things spread out, but it comes from the site. It's just one of those places where you can do whatever.
Yeah, I think it's important still to have a home base. I think it's good to have a central hub, but I think what you need to do these days is to build a kind of interlaced kind of mesh of stuff. So if people want to find their way, I mean, I find it frustrating when I find a video or a podcast or something that I'm interested in, and then I want to go and find out more about that person and see what else they have produced, because I'm interested in what I've seen so far, so I want to learn more. It's frustrating when you can't find a website if they have a website, and it's frustrating if you can't find a YouTube channel if you found an article. So I think the more you remove the friction from those things, the better. But that's different from trying to push people from one to the other. I think if people want to have those means there, so it's easy for them to, do you have links to your Facebook and website and things in your YouTube descriptions? Do you have somewhere, on your site that lists your other social media channels that people might want to connect with you? Those are basic things, but I see it so often, people not doing it, even though they have all of those things and they're working hard in those places, they don't interlink them. And I think that interlinking, and I'm not talking about sort of Google rankings and things, I'm just talking about making it easy for people to move from one place to the other and find out as much as they can and learn what they want to learn from you. So
I'm talking about going online, away from getting outside for a second, but kind of linked. You also on your site provide online courses as well. Is that a new thing, or is that just because of Corona now we can't get outside, or is that something you're planning to carry on and continue with?
Well, a little bit like the social media stuff. Like when I started in the bushcraft world, putting a lot of material on to Facebook, into Facebook groups, just sharing links to articles I'd written, people really criticized me in certain quarters, even if they think I didn't know that they did. I know that they did. People were like, oh, all this newfangled social media stuff and this, that, and the other. And some of those criticisms of social media have been borne out. There are some issues with social media, but equally, I've always just looked at ways of using what's there in terms of technology to help people learn the things that they want to learn, whether that's through sharing free materials. And, yes, I have some paid online courses, but 95% of the material that I have on the internet is for free, whether it's YouTube, podcast, articles, etc. And I started, when did I start? 2013 was when I launched my first online course. So I was quite early to the party there. And I think because I'd got up the curve quite rapidly with using, I didn't know how to register a URL. I didn't know how to register a website name when I started my company, when I started my blog, I should say. I had to learn how to do that. And so three and a bit years later, I was building an online course. And, I'd gone through that period, but I could see the potential of reaching people that you can't reach otherwise. I mean, I'd love teaching people in person, and I love running courses, and I love having a camp set up in the woods and people coming, and me, having a smallish group, 10 or 12 people that you get to know over the course of a week, and you really spend some time. And my courses aren't 9 to 5 courses. I had a guy from Hong Kong come over for a course a few years ago, and he was like, "Oh, I brought my Kindle to read in the evenings." I'm like, "You just leave that in your bag, leave it in your tent. You won't have time, because everything that we do on those courses, other than sleeping, is part of the course. Whether you're sleeping in even sleeping in a shelter is part of the course. So you're cooking your dinner on an open fire, you're learning how to manage fire. It's involved. It isn't a 9 to 5 course and then you've got time off. And so they get 90 hours of kind of contact time and learning time in the space of like a 6-day course. I mean, they're intensive periods, and I love that. I love being able to have people come and do that, but that's not something that everyone can do. They can't always get a week away from home. The catchment area, as a week-long course is always going to have a larger catchment area than a weekend course. People will travel further for a week course than they will for a weekend course. But even so, that's limited. We get a reasonable number of people coming over from continental Europe, because up until this last year, it's been easy to jump on a flight from the Netherlands or Belgium or France or Italy or wherever and come over. And we're in the southeast of England where we run our courses. So they can fly to London, they can jump on a train, get down to us. It's not too difficult. And we do occasionally get people coming from further afield. But it peters out quite quickly. We occasionally get somebody from North America. We occasionally get some from further afield, Lebanon, Canary Islands. We occasionally get people traveling from those sorts of places to do a course with us, but it's not so often. So one of the great things about an online course is that you can suddenly increase that catchment area massively and help people with what you do over a much bigger area. And that was one of my motivations for doing it. But the other main motivation was that if you come and do an online, come and do a physical course with me for the week, it's going to be a particular time of the year, right? It's going to be March or June or August or what have you. And if it's an elementary bushcraft course, we're going to teach you pretty much the same skills, whichever one of those weeks you come, whether it's in April or October. But there are certain things we can't show you at all times of the year. And that might be something simple, like what can you make some cordage out of at the moment? So in the spring, you've got the sap rising, and bark will come off things like willow quite easily once the sap rises. And then you can scrape off the outer bark, and then you make a cut, and the inner bark just comes off, and it's quite thick, and it smells really nice. It smells a bit like cucumber. And then you tear it up into strips and you can make cordage with it, and that works really well. But once you get into the middle of the summer and the back end of the year, it dries out quite a lot, and it can become really, really difficult to remove the bark. And so you can't make cordage from it until the next spring very easily. But then in the spring, you've got no nettles. The nettles are tiny. You've just got the nettles starting to come up. But by the time you get to the late summer, all the nettles are coming up, and or they're all up and they're flowered and the woody stems are there and they're fully grown, and you can harvest those and separate the fibers from the pith in the stems, and you can make really good cordage from nettles. So we're teaching you, it's the same technique for making the cordage, for making a sort of 2-ply cordage or what have you, in terms of twisting it up in your fingers and making the cordage and adding the fibers in together so that it stays strong. But the materials have to change as we go through the year. So one of the other things that I wanted to try and capture with online learning is, if someone's interested in that, I can jump you from the spring to the late summer or the autumn and show you both of those things in an online course. I can't show you them both in a physical course in the same week, whether we're in the spring or the autumn. And there's a few things like that you'd need a time machine or something to be able to cover them all in a space of a week or 10 days when you're actually in the woods. So that's one of the other benefits for me of producing, whether it's free online material on my blog or my YouTube channel or paid material. You can transport people through different seasons when it's appropriate, you know, when it's convenient for them to learn about it. So
yeah.
Nice.
The type of people who you bring onto the course, getting new people into it or already experienced, who are you not necessarily aiming your courses towards, but who's your general audience? Who are you always bringing in?
Who are we getting? Yes.
Who are your usual?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answers as to why all of these, the answers I'm about to give you. So it's quite varied. So one of the things I like about it is that you will have on a course, you will have a managing director of a company and a bricklayer and someone who looks after horses and an IT guy. You get all these different people, which is nice because you kind of get to the common humanity quite quickly around the campfire as well, which is great. You know, all of those job titles start to fade away a little bit, which is nice. So it's quite varied, which is good. I think people in all walks of life seem to want to have a greater connection with nature, and for a lot of them that's their core motivation for coming, even if they don't necessarily express it like that. You know, at the beginning of a course, we'll sit around the fire. We have one, you know, it's become a bit of a cliche, but you know, we have a parachute up and we have some logs and fire in the middle with a kettle going, and everyone comes into camp and we do some introductions and whatnot. And people will say to me things like, I grew up in the countryside, or I grew up in the suburbs. I used to play in the fields when I was a kid, and then I went to college, and then I got a job in IT, and now I sit in a cubicle all day, every day, and I feel like I'm disconnected from nature. And now we've recently moved out of town, and we've got some young kids, and I want to learn more about nature again so that I can share it with my kids. That's a common reason, that kind of, you know, that kind of narrative or that trajectory of, I used to do this when I was a kid, and then I didn't, and now I want to do it with my kids. That's often a motivation for people. You get some people again who it's not necessarily attached to their kids or having kids, but it might be just that I was in Scouts and then I got into other things, and now, you know, I want to learn some more about those sorts of things. You get some guys who are in the military who are like, I really enjoy being in the outdoors. I joined the military because I like being outdoors. I did the military thing. I don't want to do the military thing anymore, but I like being outdoors and I want to learn more. So there's that kind of narrative that you get as well. You get people who want to come and do things, you know, they want to come and do things as a family group as well. Whether they want to bring a son or a daughter with them, or, you know, niece and nephew, you know, you get people who want to have the experience of doing the course as well as a group with other family members. But typically, it's individuals who have a specific reason why. Sometimes it's because they're planning an adventure and they want to have the skills to use on the adventure. Although I have to say that isn't most people, but it is something that we see reasonably regularly. And then I think, as well as they're just wanting to connect with nature on one level or another for various reasons, the other one is, I think people, another commonality with people that we get on courses is people want to be responsible for themselves. And you see that through a number of conversations that you have with them over the course of a week, perhaps, they just kind of crop up around the campfire when you're having a cup of tea or what have you. And you'll find out that this guy over here does judo. This guy over here used to do kung fu. This guy over here did Kali, this guy. And I'm not saying we get a bunch of martial artists, but I think the commonality there is people who either feel like they have to or feel like they should take some responsibility for their own well-being on one level or another. And they don't always vocalize that or rationalize that. But my observation, and yes, it's anecdotal and it's not a scientific study, but, if I think about people that I meet, friends of friends, and you meet, a group of friends in the pub, or people you don't know, or you go to a barbecue and you chat with people, you meet the occasional person that has an interest in the outdoors, or has an interest in martial arts, or has an interest in various things. You get a bunch of people on the bushcraft course, there's a greater concentration of people who are interested in a lot of different aspects of outdoor skills, a lot of different aspects of other things, like they've done a martial art, or they like to keep fit. Or I think there's a commonality there where people aren't just sort of passively going through their life. They're kind of thinking about what, because again, these are adults who are coming, they've taken the intentional decision to come and learn something for a week. So I think that, there is a sort of biased selection there in terms of the type of people you tend to get are the people who stand up and decide that they want to learn something and commit to learning it over a period of time with a lot of those things as well, because they see it as enhancing their own abilities to look after themselves, whether they come at it from a survival skill perspective, or whether they just come at it from a life skill perspective, something that they can augment their canoe trips or their hiking trips or their family camps or whatever. They feel like they're more able to look after themselves without reliance on other people, or particularly in the context of bushcraft, without maybe so much reliance upon equipment. Because, I always say that at the heart of bushcraft really is as a knowledge of nature. It's a practical knowledge of nature. That's what bushcraft is. Yes, we can talk about knives and axes and firelighting and stuff that tends to excite people, but fundamentally, like I was saying before about what can we make string out of, you need to know the properties of the natural materials and how they fit into the seasons. And then you're into that sort of knowledge cycle and that knowledge base that indigenous peoples have, or and many of our ancestors had in the past. It's just like you're using these things, the best times to use them. You can't go to the shop and buy string. So how do we make string? So.
Yeah, I do like the fact that, especially with bushcraft, you do get away from the more, I suppose, the more commercial side of things, where you are interested in big shiny knives and whoever's got the best knives, best tent, best boots or whatever, and you're getting back to nature. And actually, you don't need all those things to do whatever. You don't need all those things to make a good camp. You've actually got everything you need pretty much there already. You don't need to take much with you, and it really is just getting back into nature, which does get. There's a lot of, like, I suppose with bushcraft, people labeled it as like hippies or whatever, but it is based on just the nature, getting back in contact with everything, and you don't have to be a hippie to do it. It's nature. We're all part of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a broad church for sure. And I think that's one of the things it's one of the reasons why people have difficulty getting their arms around what bushcraft is. Even people who are involved in teaching bushcraft, or they're just really enthusiastic about the skills that you can learn in bushcraft, they have a hard time describing it to other people, because it is different for everyone. Everyone's got their own perspective. Yes, there are people who are more spiritual, and some people might class as hippies. There are people who are maybe more at the survival end of the spectrum, who are a bit more, maybe they're not so interested in all the different edible leaves and what you can make herbal teas out of, but they're interested in how to make a shelter, how to light a fire, those sorts of practical skills. And then there's a big spectrum in between as well. And yes, there are people who there are knife collectors, and these things, you know, these are overlapping circles, aren't they? There are some people who they like collecting knives, but they also like carving and woodwork and woodcraft and whatnot. But I think sometimes that kit obsession does bleed into even bushcraft. You know, you see it, you just need to look on Instagram, you know, there's so many flat lays of kit, you know, and I think, you know, if it's canvas and leather, and then it's bushcraft, and it isn't. It's like the bushcraft is the knowledge of nature. It's the knowledge of, it's the craft that you can do with what you find in the bush. That's the meaning of the word. The tools are very useful. You know, carving a spoon without a modern steel knife is actually quite difficult. Making feather sticks without a good knife is quite difficult. And by good, I don't necessarily mean expensive. I just mean, you know, suited to the purpose. You know, you don't have to spend more than £20 on a Swedish Mora knife to have everything you'll ever need, from carving spoons and making feather sticks and, you know, all your campcraft and what have you. You don't have to spend a lot of money, in the same way as you don't have to spend a lot of money on a pen to write, but you can spend a lot of money on a nice handmade gold and, you know, whatever, if you want it, you know, with hand finished, you know, inlays and all sorts of things. You can do that in any, you know, way of life, and those things are nice to have if you want those, but you don't have to have those things. But when you don't have some basic tools, some of the bushcraft stuff becomes somewhat more difficult, and then you're kind of stepping into what people might call primitive technology then, where you're having to make stone tools and whatnot, and that's not the end of the spectrum that I'm in, really. I mean, I have done some flint knapping and, you know, hide tanning and, you know, making all those sorts of things, but that I don't run any courses on those things. It's not stuff that I use in my life. I have friends who are absolutely fantastic at those things, and I've got a lot of respect for it. But it's, for me, as I say, my focus with bushcraft was always about what skills are portable that I can apply in the context of the way that I live my life, and most people live their lives these days. And so, you know, in the same way as I'm not making a birch bark canoe before I do a canoe trip, you know, I'm not making my own clothes out of, you know, buckskin and napping a knife before I go out for a trip. So, but there, you know, these are all degrees of the same thing, you know, and you just have to decide where you want to be on that spectrum. So, but again, with all of those things, the ultimate knowledge is, how do you make that from a natural material? You know, how do you use natural materials to achieve what you want? And that's the commonality in amongst all of those things. But yes, I mean, you see it in backpacking as well, don't you? You buy an outdoor magazine like Trail Magazine or what have you, and it's full of reviews of boots and backpacks and the latest Gore-Tex jackets and stuff. And yeah, people like to have good kit. And part of it's, they don't want to die of hypothermia and they don't want blisters and all of these things, but equally it is commercialized. You know, there's a lot of stuff that's pushed on people, and I do see that in some elements of the bushcraft world as well. You see a lot of stuff when I was a kid was, you know, it either didn't exist, or if it did, it wasn't branded. Now is branded as bushcraft, and it's become a kind of a buzzword. And so you actually see products in a bushcraft line of products, and I don't really know what that means, to be honest. It's just a metal mug, you know, it's not.
Yeah. That's kind of where I suppose the definition, if there ever was a definition of bushcraft or turning it into bushcrafting, like, has it just completely merged into something completely different? Does it exist? Like, it's hard to put a definition on what is bushcraft, other than, I don't know. It's just hard to put a definition on what it is. Is there anything that you look at and you think, you know, I'd really like to be able to do that, or that's a skill that I would love to be able to be an expert in, or give it a go? Is there anything that, because you're a man of great knowledge and experience, But is there something that you still want to get into? Is there something that you still want to try and perfect?
Oh, everything still needs perfection. I think perfection is something that you move towards asymptotically. It's not something you ever arrive at. It's sort of, you get diminishing returns for your efforts as you get better at things, whatever it is. And so you never reach perfection. You just get a little bit closer. So there's always things that you want to get better at. And I think the balance is always between obsessively focusing on too narrow a field and spreading yourself too thinly. Is that you've got to try and strike that balance. And I've talked about some of those things in some of those talks that you mentioned, where I was like, how do you get up the curve with bushcraft skills? And you have to have a bit of a strategy, because otherwise, because it is a big subject, once you get past the, okay, I've got a knife and I can maybe light a fire with a fire flash or a set of matches or something, how do you move on from there? It's like, there are so many different aspects. I mean, if you can get into tracking, you can get into tree and plant identification, you can get into medicinal uses of plants, you can get into fungi identification, you can get into natural navigation. There are so many different things which could come under the umbrella of bushcraft. And so you need to be a little bit clever about what are the bases I need to cover, regardless of where I go, after that. And that's the foundation you want to have in place. And then you can then go off down other strands. And so, yeah, there's lots of different areas that I'd love to spend more time in, even though I've got a very good foundation. And I think I've probably got good knowledge up some of those paths. So I've mentioned to you, I would like to be better at flint knapping. I'm not particularly good at flint knapping, but I don't get the opportunity to do it very often. And I'd probably never be that good at it because I just don't spend a lot of time on it. But I would like to be better at that. I've only ever made a few bows in my life, but I do like archery, and I'd love to spend more time doing that. So there's plenty. I've never made a birch bark canoe, it's something, and I think being a canoeist, I'd love to make a birch bark canoe. But again, it's finding the right person to do that with, someone who knows what they're doing, not somebody who just has had a go. There are very few people left who are very good at making birch bark canoes. And so connecting with the right person and being able to persuade them to give up enough of their time and be able to find the right materials and to be able to do it in a way that's meaningful, that's not something I've managed to get around to yet, but hope that's definitely on the list.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I've seen you talking about, obviously, the difference between survival and bushcraft, which I see there is kind of a big difference between the two. They do merge. But you've had the opportunity to go and stay with various indigenous tribes as well, haven't you?
I have spent some time, yeah.
Where you have really seen where survival isn't actually survival; it's just life. It's more of it's just a lifestyle or culture or just their way of living, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's a lot of things. There's a lot of light bulbs pinging off in my brain and at the moment. So hopefully, what I have to say now is coherent, and please guide me back on track if it isn't. So one of the first things I would say is that we're you and I and everyone else that's listening to this or watching this will be thinking about that question of bushcraft versus survival from the perspective of being someone who lives probably in the developed world, probably with a lot of safety nets around them. It's actually quite hard to die, COVID notwithstanding. I would argue even with COVID being around, but some people would shoot me down for saying that. But generally, if you think about pre-March 2020, it's in the UK or Western Europe or, the States or Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all of these developed westernized nations, Korea, Singapore as well, I would include in that, Hong Kong, all of these places, it's actually quite difficult to die. Yeah, the mortality rate is low by historic standards. Yeah, and this isn't me just talking out my backside. It isn't. Mortality rate, obesity notwithstanding, yeah, mortality rates have come down. It's not often that you go around to your friend's house and it's like, where's Auntie Mary? Oh, she got taken by a lion last week. It just doesn't happen in the UK. Or, it's just like a lot of the natural hazards that we would have had to deal with until relatively recently don't exist for most of us anymore. And then that's before you start thinking about having sewers and having fresh running water whenever you want it, having warmth at the flick of a switch, good nutrition, antibiotics, vaccinations. If we get past childhood, we even as children, the mortality rate is a lot lower than it used to be. And as adults, it's a lot lower than it used to be. So we ask these questions from a very comfortable position. What is survival and what's indigenous skills. And if you are, and there aren't many left at all now, but if you're a hunter-gatherer, truly living from the land, the margins are quite low by Western developed world standards. Yeah, the mortality rate is higher just as a matter of course. And so the way you live your life, that line between surviving and dying is actually, it's a narrower margin to start off with. So we have this romantic view of living close to nature, and wouldn't it be great to be a hunter-gatherer and all these sorts of things. And in many ways it would be, because life's less complicated, maybe it's less stressful, maybe you've got more downtime, all of those things. If you read anthropological accounts from around the world, these are things that are common to hunter-gatherers. They don't spend, we were talking just before we started, you were saying how during the COVID time, it's somewhat less stressful because you're not having to commute as much. And all of these stresses that we've piled onto ourselves, hunter-gatherers don't have to deal with a 6:30 train into London and then dealing with a dickhead in the office and all of that kind of stuff that we have to deal, all these things that we've imposed on ourselves, and rushing around and too much to do and not enough time to do it in. That isn't necessarily characteristic of the way some of these people live. And so it seems attractive to us wouldn't it be nice just to go out and get food when we needed it, and we could come back and cook it on the campfire and sit around, and, wouldn't that be lovely? And in some respects, I spent some time with the Hadza, for example, and yes, some of their life is like that, but equally they have times when there isn't enough water around. They have times when there's a drought and there aren't enough plant foods around, and they can't find any animals, and they've got to dig up fallback foods for starch, and they're very good at it. But it's not as secure, it's nowhere near as secure way of living as we have in the Western world. And so we talk about the difference between survival and bushcraft from the perspective where survival situation is something that threatens our life in a way that most of the rest of our life doesn't. And that's one of the things I like about going on wilderness journeys. Like if I do a journey, even with friends or colleagues, it's not the same when you're guiding clients, because the duty of care is different there, and the situation is different. But if I do a solo trip like the Barons trip that you alluded to earlier, one of the things I like about that is you feel alive in a way that you don't when you're living life in a modern, westernized, developed economy, and there's a hospital down the road, you've got phone coverage everywhere. If you go out into the wilds, you're dependent upon your own skills to get yourself out of there, and it isn't a rush to get out of there. You've chosen to put yourself there, but you're dependent upon your own skills to see yourself through that. And you're standing on your own 2 feet as an individual, as a human being, in a way that most of the time we don't get the opportunity to. And I think that's one of the reasons people like going to wild places still, is because that they feel more alive. Not only is it an environment that feels natural to them, you know, we like being in green spaces. It makes us more relaxed. It makes us feel more at home. Natural light, you know, having the normal melatonin cycles, all of that stuff as well. But if you put yourself in a position where you're more exposed, like your decisions have more impact. If you do things wrong, there's consequence. That's one of the things that people who live closer to nature, either by choice or just because that's the way they live, have to deal with all the time. So I'm not saying it's perilous. I'm just saying that there is a greater connection between their decisions and their well-being, perhaps, and there's also perhaps less of a buffer against things going wrong. And so where the bushcraft and survival comes in, so from a modern perspective, survival skills really are about, you end up in a situation where you just need to stay alive until you can get home, you can get back to your modern way of life. You're out probably somewhere remote, although it doesn't necessarily have to be remote, but you're somewhere remote and you want to get back. And, you know, the classic scenarios are, you know, plane crash or vehicle breakdown, or you've chosen to go hiking, but then something's gone wrong, or whatever. So that then becomes a survival situation. The, you know, navigational errors, all of those sorts of things can lead to situations where you're not home when you should be, you run out of food, you get injured, you're hypothermic, all of that sort of stuff that's well documented. You know, and that's one of the reasons the military focus on survival training, because they need to use those skills when things go wrong. You know, they're not by choice going out and living off the land. It's not a Napoleonic army, you know, marching across Europe to fight the Russians, where they're having to live off turnips in the field and find food, you know, which is what armies used to have to do. You know, they're only going to be using those skills if they've been compromised, if it's an air crew that's crashed, if it's a special forces group that have been compromised and they're having to escape and evade, or whatever those situations are that they train for. But it's, whether it's the military or whether it's civilian, they're generally situations that people find themselves in unintentionally and want to get out of back to safety. So the skills that sit around the ability to do that are survival skills, and some of them overlap with bushcraft. Some of them, you know, lighting a fire to make a signal fire or to keep yourself warm or what have you. It might be exactly the same fire skills that you use at the end of the day of a, you know, if you're on a canoe trip and you want to get a fire going in camp to cook your dinner and to warm your drinks and what have you. That skill set in a survival situation might stop you from dying of hypothermia, or a friend dying of hypothermia, or what have you, but it's the same skill set. So there is an overlap for sure. And then, of course, there's a technological end to survival skills, which has probably got nothing to do with bushcraft, you know, using, you know, technology, communications technology, using, particularly when you get to the sort of military end, there's an end of survival skills there in terms of their training, in terms of escaping and evading and getting back to friendly forces, that involves the use of technology, which is a survival skill. It stops them from being killed or captured, but it isn't anything to do with bushcraft per se. So there's an overlap between survival and bushcraft. In terms of the use of natural resources, I would say survival skills sit within bushcraft, because they're skills that you use all the time. Lighting fires, building shelters, perhaps making water safe, natural navigation, they're all stuff that you could use optionally normally if you're on a trip. But if you're in a difficult situation, then you can use them to help yourself in that situation. But then bushcraft goes beyond that. Bushcraft's about making yourself comfortable and being able to live in the environment. And you're there intentionally, normally. You're not trying to get home. you actually have gone to the wild place or the woods or wherever, and you want to spend some time there, and you want to, you know, make use of some of the natural materials that are there. And of course, the basic bushcraft skills came out of that kind of expeditionary mentality. You know, if you think about somebody like Baden-Powell, who isn't really a bushcrafter as such, but if you look at Scouting for Boys, a lot of the stuff in there overlaps with the woodcraft and the bushcraft books. You know, Ernest Thompson Seton, Mason's books, all of those sort of woodcraft and camping books. There's a massive overlap between what's in there and what's in the scouting stuff. And don't forget that, you know, Baden-Powell was an expeditionary warfare guy. He was fighting in the Boer War, and he overlapped with people like Frederick Russell Burnham, who was an American scout, who again was involved in expeditionary warfare. And that expeditionary warfare stuff goes right back to the people like Robert Rogers, who was a British soldier who was, you know, fighting in the French and Indian Wars. And they were moving away from this regimented, let's all wear red coats and line up and fight each other like we did in Europe. And they were having to fight more guerrilla style warfare in the woods, you know, in North America. And they had to be able to operate with relatively little equipment and use some of the natural materials that were around them, and use some of the skills that the native peoples used in those places, because otherwise they couldn't deal with what was going on there. So a lot of the bushcraft that comes back through people like Frederick Russell Burnham, Robert Rogers, Baden-Powell is entirely down to not being on the run in those places, choosing to go to those places, but needing to operate with limited equipment in those places. And that kind of became, in some ways, it wasn't the only strand, but that became one of the big strands in what we now call bushcraft. It's the ability to go to places and use the natural materials with limited equipment.
Yeah, and
long answer, sorry.
No, that's really good. No, that's fine. So you kind of touched on it there as well, but maybe not necessarily. It could be bushcraft in your eyes, but why, in your opinion, do you think it's important that people do get outside and engage with the world?
Engage with the natural world.
Yeah, engage with the natural world.
But, you know, again, there's a philosophical question there, isn't there? You know, humans are a natural phenomenon, so isn't it all nature? You know, it's like, does an ant sit there looking at the anthill going, this is not natural, you know, we built this. You know, I like being over there by that tree because that's nature, but this anthill is too busy. I don't know, and it's a bit of a silly question, but it does illustrate the point that we do tend to see ourselves as distinct from nature, and the environments that we build as distinct from nature. And I think I've offended Christians by saying this in the past. And my mum is an Anglican priest, so I feel kind of qualified to say a little bit about this. One of the things that I get that's a strand in Christian teaching is that we're special and that we're separate. And maybe we are, but the problem is that we tend to be disdainful of the rest of nature. And I think you know, Western culture is largely based on, philosophically, it's largely based on Christian thinking. I mean, it's mixed in with lots of other things, and there's lots of other philosophical thinking there as well. But a lot of the ethics that we apply to the world are based around being Christian societies in Western Europe and exporting that to North America and whatnot. And we do tend to see ourselves as somewhat superior or different or other. And I think that's one of the reasons, perhaps, and it is, maybe I'm reaching a little bit, but it's possible that that's one of the reasons why we have something of an environmental crisis now, because we felt like we're special and we're separate and we can treat nature however we want. And it's there for our benefit. God created it for our benefit. Well, maybe he didn't, maybe she didn't, maybe they didn't, however, whichever pronoun we want to use. But the point is, I think it's hard baked into our culture to see ourselves as different from nature. And fundamentally, though, we're not. You know, we we're a primate. We came out of nature, and long as you're not scared of being tired and cold and hungry, being out in the wilds for a lot of people, not everyone, but for a lot of people, is actually quite a therapeutic thing, even if they don't necessarily realize it before they get there. You only need to see some of the emerging research about mental health, whether it's people that are maybe at the more obvious end of mental health problems with schizophrenia and things, the benefits to just having some time outdoors, whether it's people with depression, anxiety, whether it's people with substance addictions, all sorts of things, just getting away from that kind of high frequency, stressful, in some ways overstimulating, but in some ways understimulating world that we've put ourselves in. We put ourselves in a box, with plain walls, with not much in the way of bird song or wind or breeze or anything. And yet we've got this thing in front of our face that's trying to distract us all the time, whether it's a phone or a screen and what have you. And that's horribly stressful for a lot of people, even if they don't realize it, and there's a lot of FOMO, there's a lot of comparisons, there's a lot of they've got this, I don't have that. And there's a lot of stresses that people are exposed to all the time insidiously, and just getting out into the woods, turning your phone off, bit of a, digital detox, if you want to call it that, but just changing the priorities of your focus and your attention. And, I run a tracking course, and one of the things we have to do at the beginning of that tracking course for the course to be, as successful as it can be, is just to get people to chill out for a few days. Mm-hmm. Just to stop being so distracted by their own thoughts, stop thinking about what was going on at work the Friday before, stop thinking about what's going on at home, the argument they had with their partner last week, or whatever it is that's pinging in their brain, and just focus on what's in front of them. They're trying to find and look for, signs of animals and people, and, what's gone on, and notice the animal tracks and sign, and then learn to follow them, and tuning into that environment. And again, some people see it as hippie-ish, but it isn't the way that we teach it. It's very much about observation and deduction and being present. And there's some overlaps perhaps with meditation there as well, and just pushing aside the distractions and focusing on what's in front of you, maybe in a slightly more gentle way. And one of the things I certainly noticed when I first did a tracking course 20 years ago, similar program to what we teach, and I got the train down to London, and then I got the tube through London, and then I got the train down to the south of England, and that all seemed fairly normal. And then I did this week in the woods where we're just, really being encouraged to pick up on the nuances in nature, and creases in the blade of grass, and listening for bird song, and all, just tuning into nature a bit more. When I got back on the train, and I think it was East Grinstead I got on the train, and it was one of those old slam door trains, I just remember the noise. The noise was really impactful, the slamming of the door and the train, the speed at which people were rushing around, sitting down on the seat in the train, and the dust coming up, you could smell it, and getting back into London, and the speed at which people were going, and the fumes, and everything was just written that much larger and more vividly, which in a way was good. But it was also too much. It was too intense. And what happens is, and we all know this, is that we kind of start to filter everything out. We just kind of shut down. And I think one of the good things about getting into natural environments is you don't have to go and do a tracking course. If you just go and spend a long weekend in the woods, and I would say that's probably about the minimum amount of time it takes, a long weekend in the woods, or a canoe trip, or you don't have to be in the same place, but just quiet, natural environment for a hike or a camp or a canoe trip or what have you, after a few days, you just kind of go, ah, and then your brain opens to what's going on, and you start to feel properly engaged with the environment that's around you. And I think that's what we were designed. You can either say that's what we were designed to do, or that's what we evolved to do, depending on your beliefs. But fundamentally, that's what we're wired up to do really well, is to function in those environments. And the pace at which we take on information and process information, and it's tuned to that frequency, as it were, and it takes a while for people to kind of defrag when they leave town. And most people live in towns or the suburbs these days. You know, developed world, about 80% of people in most developed countries live in or near large conurbations. And so it's something that's beneficial to many people. And you can, yes, when you get back on the train, you smell the dust and the noise is loud and etc., but you feel rejuvenated when you get back as well. So it's beneficial even when you go back into town. And I think if you're used to going out into the woods or out on a canoe trip or whatever it is that you do, the more you do that, the more frequently, the quicker you can sort of switch into enjoying it for what's there. I think if you haven't been camping for a long time, or maybe ever, many people have never camped. Many people have never, I mean, this is one thing I find running courses. Many people have never spent a night out under canvas of any description. They've never slept out in the woods, even in the UK, where there's nothing that's going to harm you. I mean, okay, there's an increasing number of ticks perhaps as the temperature, the average temperatures go up a bit, and there's maybe a bit more risk of Lyme disease, but we've, you know, antibiotics and whatnot can deal with that. But the risk is minuscule. The risk compared to crossing the road is minuscule. Yeah, the risk compared to driving is minuscule. So it's not something that I worry about. And if you're really worried, you can, you know, sleep in a tent rather than under a tarp or what have you. But many people have never slept outside. There's so many people who've never been for a poo outside, you know, and and it amazes me that it's like, yeah, just getting back a little bit to the natural environment, you know, having a shower out, you know, putting a bush shower up, and yeah, okay, you can put a tarp around it, but just having a shower outside and on a summer's day, I mean, it's fantastic. You know, it's those things, we're so disconnected from that, and I think we're increasingly disconnected from it. We're increasingly living in a virtual world, and it's kind of ironic that we're sat here on Zoom talking about this, but it's kind of slightly the nature of the times that we're living in with COVID. One of the reasons I haven't done many podcasts recently is that I like having conversations in person with people. You know, I like to put the recorder on the table and have an eye to eye, face to face conversation, but that's harder to do at the moment. But yeah, just having, you know, so it can be very base. It can be just sleeping, you know, it can be sleeping outside. It can be going to the toilet outside. It can just be having a wash outside, but it's a very different experience to doing that in a bathroom, in your flat, in your house, or what have you. And then all of the inputs that are there, you know, the greenery, you know, there's research that suggests even just showing people pictures of trees, their cortisol levels go down, their stress levels go down, never mind getting them out into the forest. And you've perhaps heard of this concept of forest bathing as well, which came out of Japan, which again is sort of built on that concept of just going out and soaking up the sight and the sounds and the smells of the forest. And even if you don't understand it, it helps. It helps your mental state. It helps your well-being. And so I think it's important, you know, if you can look at it from a selfish individual perspective, like it, you know, if you're listening to this, it's good for you if you go outside and spend some time in nature. It's good for your well-being and probably your longevity. And that's before you get into the benefits of exercise and fresh air and all those sorts of things. Just mentally, it's good for you. But then also, I think, you know, if we look at it from a societal level, if you've got people who are less aggravated, less anxious, less depressed, less suicidal, whatever, that's probably good for society as well, if we all benefited from that as well. So I think, you know, whichever level you look at it, I think it's important.
Yeah, and you were just saying, obviously, that there are a whole load of people who have never slept outside or spent a lot of time outside at all. What do you think are the barriers there? What is stopping people getting outside and sleeping outside? Do you put that down to? So I've asked the questions to previous people before. Like, do you put that down to social media, making it so accessible just in your pocket while you're sat on the sofa? What do you think are the barriers to stopping people getting outside a bit more?
I think some of it's just fear. I think there's a culture. I think there's a cultural aspect as well, and I can't answer the cultural aspect. I've had some conversations with some ethnic minority members about this, because we don't get that many on our courses. Yeah. But we get some, and I'm always interested to talk to them about why they came. Why are they there rather than their brother or their friend? And I'm not singling them out. I'm just interested, and why they felt that they could come. And I think we are seeing a shift there. I mean, you see more people of different ethnic minorities, different ethnic backgrounds, hiking and mountain biking and canoeing, but it's slow. And I think there's a cultural aspect. I think for some groups, it's just not something that they've done culturally. Yeah. They have other things they do. They have their own festivals. They have their own ways of being together and doing things, and their own cultural identity and their own traditions. And it doesn't necessarily involve camping or hiking or sleeping outside. And even for Western Europe, even for white Western Europeans, walking up a mountain isn't something that we've been doing very long. It kind of started, it was a Victorian thing. If you think about, what do we call the mountains in Scotland? We call them Munros, and that was after Sir Hugh Munro, who was a Victorian guy who went around noting down, it became a thing, and the Victorians were great collectors of things. It was kind of, that era seemed to be, if you look at the collections in the Natural History Museum, I mean, they were obsessive collectors of stuff. But they also collected, mountain peaks, and, that was kind of their mentality. But before that, it wasn't normal for people just to go, oh yeah, I'll just go for a hike up a hill, or, why? They were too tired from working in the fields all day, or whatever, or, in the factory or what have you. And so we have more leisure time now, but we have less contact with nature. And I think that's the gap we're trying to bridge. That, okay, now we've got the time, what do we do with it? Do we sit on our phone, or do we watch Netflix, or do we go out for a hike? And that has to be a conscious decision. I think we kid ourselves that there's a stronger tradition of us going out and doing those things than there actually is. I don't think there is. I think those of us that go out and enjoy nature understand the benefits of it, and that's why we do it. It's a positive reinforcing feedback loop. As I started off at the beginning of this conversation, I grew up in the countryside, so for me, it's not abnormal to go out for a hike across the fields. It's not abnormal to go out for a bike ride. It's not unusual to do those things. I grew up doing that stuff. But equally, I could imagine if I grew up in the inner city somewhere, maybe that just would feel completely alien to me.
Yeah, and that's kind of, so saying that, kind of bridging that gap, especially for those inner city people, I suppose. How do you think we could bridge that gap? What is missing?
Make
is there
it
anything
fun.
that we make it fun? Yeah. Is there anything that particularly? I know there's some schools who provide outdoor education and like bushcraft classes and all that sort of stuff, but in my knowledge, I know that they're slightly higher up schools, kind of more private schools, bit high, like, yeah. Is there anything that we could be introducing at that level, at a school level, or is there anything that's missing, do you think?
Well, I think one of the big things, and I don't know the figures, but it used to be the case, certainly when I was at school, even, I went to school in the countryside, but even the school I went to, which was it was a comprehensive school, it was a fairly decent state school, but it was, it wasn't a private or a public school. It was just a state school in the northeast of England. We went and stayed. We had the opportunities to go away and stay somewhere in the Lake District for a week and do activities. When I was even at primary school, when I was in North Wales, we had the opportunity to go away and stay at there's a Welsh youth organisation, the Earth. They have centres, and we had the opportunity to go there, and we did some kayaking, we went biking, we did some stuff in the swimming pool, and even though it might only be a week, those things leave a lasting impression on young people. And I think there's definitely been a cut in funding for those things. There's been a lot of local educational authorities no longer have outdoor centres, and those places struggle for funding those that exist. And of course, and then on top of that, we've had COVID, and I'm sure we will see some financial issues for some of those centres going forwards, places in the Lake District and North Wales and Scotland, and places that take kids residentially to do outdoor activities. And I think those things are important. In the grand scheme of things, they don't cost a huge amount of money. In the grand scheme of even education, they don't cost a lot of money. And, I think one of the things we should be doing is maybe having a slightly broader view of what education is. We've seen, I'm not against testing, and I'm not against, measuring people's performance, but equally, I think we've got a little bit bogged down in that in recent years. And, the kids are getting stressed about exams at an age when I didn't even think about exams. And I think they should be being introduced to various different experiences at that age, not being stressed about academics. There's plenty of time for that later on. And other countries manage to get good academic performance and maybe balance it with outdoor life a little bit better than we do in the UK. So I think there's definitely scope for even a city centre, comprehensive school, state school, to be able to send kids to an outdoor activity centre for 5 days instead of being at school for that week, and seeing a different, having a different perspective on life and having fun doing that.
And I think going beyond school, I think that there's also that fear of where to start, and some people want to go in right at the deep end and can't afford to do it, or think they can't afford to do it, or they have to climb the biggest mountain or whatever. And something I heard you say is be realistic, not romantic. And I think that really touches home. That is exactly what you need to go out with. Just be realistic. You don't need to go out and climb the biggest mountain. Just go out for a walk locally, start small.
Yeah. I mean, that does sound like something I would say. So I believe you. But yeah, I mean, in terms of wanting to do trips, absolutely. And I think one of the things that gets in people's way, I mean, people put all sorts of barriers in their own way, but equally, going back to the point about FOMO and commercialization and social media and influencers and all these sorts of things, people sometimes they feel like they have to have the best sleeping bag and the best boots and the best tent and the best knife or what have you before they can even go and spend a night out. And again, I had the advantage of sleeping in, I remember when my friends and I were about 13, and we took, my mate had this rubbish A-frame tent that was just big enough for 2 of us to get into, and 3 of us went off it wasn't far away. It was like a mile away from the house. And there was this area where this stream ran through between two farms, and it was all wooded. And we used to play in there a lot and mess around in there. And we went and camped in there, and we didn't have permission. I mean, but equally, we didn't kind of get who we would have had to ask anyway at that age, you know. But I had the benefit of just like, okay, we had a rubbish night's sleep, and it was cold, and we tried to cook some beans, and it was just a disaster. Mm-hmm. But, well, it was a disaster from the perspective of not everything was perfect, but it was not a disaster at all. Nobody died. Yeah. Nobody was injured. We had a good experience. I still remember it now, you know, 35 years later. Some May bank holiday sometime, I think it was. But the thing is, people haven't had those experiences. They kind of need to pop that bubble and kind of not worry so much. Yeah, okay, if you're going to go and sleep out in the north of Sweden in the middle of winter, you could die. Yeah. But if you go out in the woods in the UK in May or June or July, I mean, you'd struggle to die. I mean, you really would. You know, you can sleep out under the stars with a blanket. You know, you're fine. Nothing's going to chew your face off. Nothing's going to happen to you, and you're not going to die of hypothermia. The worst that's going to happen in the UK is you get rained on, you get wet. And in the summer, you're probably going to be all right anyway. In the woods, in the mountains, you might not be. You know, in the hills in the summer, if you get rained on and it's windy, you can still die of hypothermia. But you struggle to die of hypothermia in the woods in the UK in the summer, not least because you're not that far away from anywhere. If you do, if you just decide you've had enough, you just pack up and go home. Yeah. So I think people, again, just need to, yes, be realistic in that sense as well. It's like, okay, what are the concerns really? You know, when I first started backpacking, there was only two things I really spent any money on, and that was a half decent pair of boots. But I was lucky. I went to an outdoor shop and I said, I can't afford the Zambalans and the whatever else. I said, what have you got that's a similar quality that maybe isn't as well known a brand? And the guy was like, well, these are a full grain leather, but they were like, half the price of some of the others. So I was like, I know I need some decent boots, and I know I need a half decent backpack so I don't cripple myself. But my sleeping bag was cheap. It was way too heavy for the warmth, but I was young and I was fit. And so, it doesn't matter that much. My tent was heavy and not brilliant, and it sort of leaked at the seams a bit because it was cheap. And I just used a closed cell foam mattress. I didn't have an expensive thermarest. And I think I had a cheap gas stove. I had army surplus. I think they were Dutch military surplus combat trousers that had been dyed black that cost me about £9, and a Norgie shirt, which was cotton. That was my warm layer. And I had a Gore-Tex jacket that I had from mountain biking, and off I went into the Scottish Highlands for a week, and I didn't die, and I had a great time. And, I was a student, and I think sometimes you can overcomplicate things. There are certain things that are important and certain things that are much less important. Yes, they're nice to have. I've got much better equipment now for all sorts of different conditions and different environments. But fundamentally, I went out with, I thought realistically about what I needed to keep myself warm and safe and comfortable. And then the rest I just fudged. And that was fine. Yes, I ended up with a soggy Norgie shirt that I couldn't get dry. Yes, I had sores on my shoulders because my backpack was too heavy, because my sleeping bag weighed 2 kilograms and my tent weighed 3 kilograms and all of this stuff. But I had a great time, and I learned from it as well. And I think that's one of the things that you try not to have a perfect time, because one is you stress yourself out before you go, you spend too much money, and if the experience you have then is not perfect, you feel like you've failed. I mean, the just stepping out the door to do the trip, you've succeeded. That's the important thing. So I think people put too much pressure on themselves because of a lot of the time it's because of what they see other people doing. And I try, I'm conscious that, I'm professionally involved in the outdoors. And so if I make a YouTube video, I have got a 400-pound jacket on perhaps, or I've got a really good tent, or whatever it is, because that I use those things hundreds of days a year normally. And for me, it's the cost per use is tiny and they last a long time. But for somebody else, the use case might not be the same. But I'm always conscious that people, you know, I see it all the time. I make a video and it's about, you know, how to make string or something out of this. And then people go, what jacket are you wearing? And I'm like, the jacket's not important. It's the skill's the important thing. But people always want to, and I get it. You want to shortcut your own mistakes. You want to go, well, if Paul's using it, it must be good. That's the rationale, or I like the look of that, or what have you. And to be honest, I did similar things when I was younger. You know, I kind of inquired after what people were using, because you think, well, if they've settled on that as being good, then I don't have to waste money buying 4 things on the way and getting it wrong. I'll just get that thing. So I do understand that, but equally, that's flipped on its head a lot of the time with, you know, this sort of influence of marketing where people are just being used as, you know, clothes dolls to put nice equipment and clothing on to put in front of people on social media, and then people feel like they have to have that before they can even step out of the door. And I think that's a barrier to people sometimes, which is unfortunate. So
yeah, absolutely. We'll have 2 more points then to finish on. Is if there is one thing that you would really encourage people to get outside to experience and do, what would that be? And the second thing is, what actually makes you get outside? What do you personally go outside for? What do you gain from it as an individual?
Okay, well, I'll take those one by one. I mean, the first one, it depends where people are at with their experience, you know. So if someone's never camped out before, then try and do that, because and get some of the basics around that sorted, because once you've got that, you can then start making some journeys if you want to, or you can just stay in the woods for longer, or, you know, whatever you want to do. But I think one of the fundamentals is just being comfortable enough with the basics to, and I'm not saying people have to build a shelter and all, you know, just because I teach bushcraft and survival skills and whatnot, just, you know, just get a tent or a tarp and a few bits and pieces and be comfortable with spending a night out, because it's liberating. One of the other things I see sometimes that people worry about is just the ability to make water safe. I've had quite a few people say to me over the years, I only do 2-day hikes because that's as much as the water I can carry. And I'm like, okay, well, I only ever carry that much water if I'm, say, camping up high in the mountains in the summer in Scotland, and I know that there's not much chance of there being water up there, and I need to cook some pasta and have a drink and carry on until I get down the other side the next day. Otherwise, I'm only going to carry a couple of liters at a time typically and source it as I go. But it's that sourcing it as you go that worries people. People are worried about, you know, being able to make water safe, and they're worried about making themselves ill, and they're worried about trusting the filter or the chemicals or whatever it is that they might be using. And I think part of that is down to companies sort of marketing one particular product and then another marketing another. So like filter and chemicals, both will work well under certain circumstances, but people don't know, do I need to use one or both, or do I use the chemicals and then the filter? Do I use the filter then the chemicals? What do I do? How do I do it? So just, and the stuff on my blog, there's plenty of stuff online. Just find out from somebody who's traveled a lot how to make water safe. I've never had a bad stomach from water traveling anywhere in the world. So there's some basic things you can put in place there. And once you understand that, because that's one of the big limiting factors for doing, whether you want to stay in one place for a while or whether you want to make a journey, you've got to get water from somewhere. And so understanding that is important, I think, particularly if you want to go a little bit further, especially if you want to travel under your own steam. So those are things that I think if you really are starting out and want to spend more time out camping, journeying, whatever it is, basics like that are important. And then if you're already a hiker, maybe try a canoe trip. And if you're a canoeist, maybe do a bit more hiking, you know, go and do things in a way that you're not used to. I would say I'd try and encourage people to do that, because from a kind of experiential point of view, it's good. Put yourself, it doesn't have to be out your comfort zone even, it's just you're rounding out your skill set. But from a engagement with nature perspective, one of the things we talked about canoeing a bit before, but we didn't kind of go down that route much. I started out, the journeys that I used to do when I was younger were backpacking trips. I didn't get into canoeing until quite a bit later. And one of the things I liked about canoeing was it enabled me to see the world from almost the flip side, sort of from the inside out, you know. So, you know, if you're a hiker, you come to a river or a lake through the lens of being on the land and looking at it maybe as an obstacle, or looking at it maybe as just a source of water or somewhere to camp next to that night, or however you view it. And you maybe come to a river through the woods, or you come to a lake through the woods, or you come down the hill, or what have you, and you see it as other, which is, and it's slightly, even if you enjoy a bit of wild swimming or whatever, it tends to be something that is slightly out of reach. It's not the place you're inhabiting for most of the trip. And then when you go and do a canoe trip, it's almost the opposite. You're inhabiting the water, albeit you're on a little bobby thing on top of the water for most of the time, but you're inhabiting the water world on that trip for most of the time that you're moving. And then you come to shore when you want to camp, in the same way as you might go to the water when you want to camp when you're on the land, and you camp next to the water in that way. So you're kind of looking at the land from the opposite perspective, and you're traveling in a way that maybe you couldn't hike, you know, again, you couldn't hike perhaps through some of the places that you can canoe through, because of the nature of what's on the side of the rivers, the nature of the terrain, the density of the forest, whatever it is, it's becomes a highway through certain environments as well. So I think it kind of completes the picture in a way, both in terms of the way that you see and appreciate the landscape. I know now when I come to a river, and even if I'm on a backpacking trip, I come to a river and look at it, I see it through the eyes of not just a hiker, but I see it through the eyes of a canoeist as well. I understand much more about what's going on in the water. And that might be useful sometimes for river crossings, but that I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that just your appreciation of the environment, you can appreciate it with a greater depth of knowledge and experience. And I think that's a good thing to do. And I think one of the good things about going back to backpacking after canoeing is you get a bit fat and lazy when you're canoeing. And I don't just mean it from the perspective of, you know, your figure, but I also mean it from the perspective of you can maybe take a few more luxuries in terms of what you might have in camp. And as soon as you're backpacking, you're conscious of every gram on your back, and I think it reasserts a certain discipline, which I think is good as well. So I think there's lots of different benefits. So if I was to generalize that, and I know I've talked about hiking and canoeing, but you know, if there's a mode of transport that you've not tried before that involves, you know, camping, overnighting, or what have you, maybe try that just to put you out of your normal routine. I think that's a good thing to do, because it rounds out your perspectives on lots of different fronts. Your second question was about what I like doing and why, but can you rephrase it just so I've got the detail, please?
So obviously it's something that's quite difficult to put your finger on, but as in, why do you as an individual go outside? What do you gain from it? What draws you outside every time other than work?
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction to make. And I think that's an important thing for people who do maybe turn their hobby and passion into outdoor work, is it can just all become work. And that's something over the years, sometimes I've fallen into, and I'm very conscious to have my own time now and time with colleagues and clients and students, and enjoy all of them for their own reasons, but also understand that there's a difference, and not just to get sucked from one into the other. So when I go and do my own thing, it is intentional. And I you know, humans are social. And I do like spending time with other people. And I do like spending time with people around the campfire. But I think one of the things I like doing when I go and do things for myself is just having a bit of me time. And not from a selfish perspective, but just, you know, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm probably on the introverted end of the spectrum. And I do find being with other people all the time, after a while, somewhat draining. And I do find it kind of rejuvenating just to have a bit of me time. And it doesn't have to be days and weeks, you know, a day or what have you, but just having a bit of time to myself, gather my thoughts. I like, when I'm walking, I like the fact that it's good thinking time. I used to like, when I used to do a lot of cycling as well, I used to find it was good thinking time, but walking, I think, serves that purpose for me now. So it's good thinking time. And it doesn't have to, not hard thinking or scheming or work, or it's just like, it's just good to let things fall into place and put a perspective on things. And I think that's one of the things, even just going out for a walk for 2 hours, it allows you to put a perspective on things, you know, sort of mentally take a breath and just let the dust settle. So that's important to me. And then I just enjoy, you know, particularly at the time of year we're recording this, we're just sort of coming into spring. The birds are singing more, the buds are, you know, swelling. Some of the spring flowers are coming up and catkins are extending. And I just love all the detail of the changing of the seasons, particularly in the spring and in the autumn. I just really enjoy the detail and the, you know, we often see the world as, you know, culturally we see it as winter, spring, summer, autumn, or fall, but there's a continuous change going on, and I enjoy witnessing that. And so just sort of regular outings to see what's going on and see where we're at. And during this COVID time, I think that's one of the things I've struggled with, because I'm so used to spending so much time outdoors. One thing I noticed last year, I'd been in it kind of messes me up a little bit when I go to the other half of the world, but I'd been in Australia over the year end, and then I came back to the UK for a bit, back into winter, and then I went to Canada to do a couple of things. But I always enjoy coming back, whether it's from northern Sweden or from, you know, snowy parts of Canada, coming back sort of end of February, beginning of March, and it's almost like you've jumped into spring. It just feels warm, and the snowdrops and the daffodils and what have you, where we are at the moment, pretty much. And then I always feel like there's an energy in spring, like things are moving quickly. You know, the days are getting longer quickly around the time of the equinox, and it just feels like stuff's happening. And I like that energy. But then of course we got closed down with COVID last year. And, you know, amongst all the other stresses of having a business that's involved with outdoor education and stuff, after a while, I realized that I was like, it got to, I don't know, June or something. I was like, I've disconnected from the natural world. I just haven't really paid attention to the spring, whereas normally I'm really paying attention, even if it isn't sort of consciously. And I just felt like I'd lost my anchor into the natural kind of cycle. And I hadn't even realized how fully that was important to me. You know, that annual cycle and being part of it and witnessing it. And because I'm normally just out, and as I said to you before, we tend to start running most of our UK courses around about Easter, is kind of, you know, late March, early April. And I'll spend more time on my own, doing my own stuff in the winter. And then I get into doing stuff with customers more in the summer. But in between that, you know, I'm still doing my own thing. I'm going out for walks. I'm doing canoe trips, even if it's just day trips. And I'm kind of constantly seeing what's going on. And last year, that just didn't happen. And so I think for me, I don't know if this really answers the question, but for me, it's just being kind of connected and anchored to what's going on. And that really became apparent to me last year, that was important, because it wasn't there in the same way as it normally is. So, and one of the things I've been able to do in this sort of COVID year is sort of reflect back on previous trips and sort photographs and go through old video footage that I forgot I had on hard drives and all sorts of things, and look back and then try and work out when that was, when was that, and look back through calendars. And one of the things I realized that I do is that I do put a lot of stuff in my calendar. If I'm not doing something with customers, it might be between courses, I'm going for a hike, or I come back from a bunch of courses in the UK. I've got a bit of time at home. I've got to catch up with stuff, and then I'll go and do something in Scotland on my own before I start doing something with customers in Scotland. So I have that need to be doing stuff on a regular basis and be connected with the seasons as we go through them. And I love camping in the winter. I love camping in the summer. I love waking up on a canoe journey in the fall when the water's still warm but the air's cold at night, and you get all the mist, and all of those things are fantastic. And to miss chunks of it, really, I feel like I'm sort of missing a chunk of, it's almost like a sort of time warp in a way. Like if you go from spring to summer without really noticing the spring, I feel kind of quite disconcerted, or I did last year anyway. So for me, I think keeping in contact with that natural cycle is important. It's one of the, whether I'm hiking or camping or canoeing or snowshoeing or whatever it is, it's just, so I can't explain it any better than that. So for me, it's about recharging, keeping that connection with nature, whatever that means, and having a bit of me time when I'm doing stuff on my own, for sure. Yeah,
I think that's pretty much like a perfect place to finish it, really. I think that's something that everybody could, especially now, everybody could benefit from all of those things. We all need to get outside and re-engage with the natural world and recharge and just get outside. Yeah. And if people want to get onto your courses, where do we go?
Frontierbushcraft.com is the main hub for all the, whether it's field courses, online courses, overseas trips, they're all there. If people are particularly interested in the online courses, they can go directly to onlinebushcraftcourses.com, but everything links from Frontier, so frontierbushcraft.com is the place to go and check everything out. So,
brilliant.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Lovely to talk to you, and
you
keep
too.
in touch. Keep in
Definitely.
touch. Yeah. Take care.
See you later. Cheers.
Yeah,
Thank
cheers.
you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.